Good afternoon. My name is Irene Whelan, and I'm a niece of Thomas Whelan, the man I'm going to be talking about in this presentation. I grew up in the house where he was born, and I grew up listening to my grandmother's stories about him, and of course my father's. And we have a clip from my father towards the end of the talk that was done in 1996 by Connemara Community Radio. So that's a wonderful thing to have. These were very sad events for our family, of course, and it's wonderful that we're able to commemorate it on this occasion of the 100th anniversary of Tommy Whelan's death. So my thanks to Galway County Council, Marie Mannion and Gary Kelly, and all the people who have worked with me on this. Roughly 2 miles west of the town of Clifden in North Connemara, on the fringe of an estate developed by John Darcy in the early decades of the 19th century, lies the townland of Gaeltacht. It is a mixture of rough pasture, some large fertile squared fields, and small walled fields typical of the rural west. The mixture accurately reflecting the English translation of the place name as broken land. It is an area that has known long habitation, appearing in the famous Down Survey of 1665-66, drawn up by William Petty after the Cromwellian settlement, a century and a half before the foundation of the town of Clifden. By the early 20th century, the once vibrant village, famous for its spring wells and the 13 smokes of the resident households, had emptied out. The only couple there with a growing family were John and Bridget Whelan, born in 1864 and 1866 respectively, and married in 1887. Over the following 2 decades, they produced a family of 13, 10 sons and 3 daughters. These children would grow to adulthood in a world defined by war, revolution, and continuing mass emigration from their Connemara homeland. But none of them would experience such a fatal end as their 5th child, Thomas, born in 1898 and destined to die on the scaffold in Mountjoy jail in Dublin on March 14th. 1921, one of the last to make this ultimate sacrifice in the cause of Irish freedom. By the standards of the early 20th century west of Ireland, the Whelan family was relatively comfortable. The children attended the local national school at Gaeltacht, a quick run across the fields from the High Road, now the famous Skye Road, and were lucky enough to be within distance of a secondary school in Clifden. The other great advantage the family enjoyed or benefited from, both economically and socially, was the presence of a coastguard station built in 1875 and staffed by officers and their families. At the outbreak of World War I in 1914, the familiar pattern of chain migration was already underway, and the 3 eldest Whelan offspring were already in the United States. The coming of the war stopped emigration temporarily, but in the latter half of 1917, 2 of the brothers left home within a couple of months of each other. Paddy to join the Royal Navy in September, and his brother Tommy, younger by 3 years, left for Dublin in November. While it is clear that Paddy's departure was planned and expected, Tommy's clearly was not. At the time, Tommy, that is, was working as a messenger boy, that's what we call a PA or a personal assistant these days, for the parish priest, a Monsignor Patrick McAlpine, an impassioned, larger-than-life political priest from County Mayo, who exercised a dominating influence in Clifden and the surrounding area. McAlpine was a staunch supporter of John Redmond's Home Rule Party and the land reform programme of the United Irish League. It was apparently an altercation over political sympathies that caused him to admonish his young assistant, allegedly for Sinn Féin sympathies, the consequence of which was that Tommy Whelan left in short order and moved to Dublin. Once in Dublin, he got work in Boland's Mills and found lodgings in the vicinity with a family called Mann, who lived at number 14 Barrow Street in Ringsend. The Manns were of German origin, and like many of their compatriots in the 19th century, they had come to Ireland to seek out opportunities in the music industry. The father had a business that took him around the country tuning pianos. Many of the family, including their only daughter Alicia, sang and played the piano, and the house was well known for musical evenings. This was undoubtedly a huge attraction for Tommy Whelan, whose passion was music. He had a fine singing voice and spent much of his spare time taking music lessons and practicing his singing. The family was known for this. It was something they loved to do. Tommy took it seriously enough to take his music lessons and to enter competitions and win prizes. His ambition apparently was to join his siblings in the United States and to develop a career as a professional singer. The Manns were also railway enthusiasts, and this may have been the connection that got him a new position at the Broadstone station. This was considered a step up. It meant respectable employment with prospects of stability and promotion. He would be the first in his family in Ireland to enjoy this. The work environment would also have been eminently suited to his political sympathies, as transport workers were in the forefront of the Labour and nationalist movements. Everything we know about Tommy Whelan during this period in Dublin is based on the letters he wrote from prison, the witnesses who came forward to provide evidence on his character, and the testimony of those who got to know him while he was in prison. All describe a young man with a cheerful outlook on life and a generous spirit, a trusting, almost guileless nature, and a transcendent spirituality that would become especially apparent in the weeks before his execution. Before leaving Clifden, he had been in Sinn Féin and the Volunteers, and he transferred this membership to Dublin. In addition to his music and his politics, he appears to have developed a deeply religious mindset, pronounced even in the atmosphere of the times, reflecting the deepening connection between nationalism and religious identity in the revolutionary atmosphere that swept the country in the years after 1916. In Ringsend, he had joined a sodality and become a weekly communicant. As he turned 22 on the 15th of November 1920, there was nothing to suggest he was anything but a young man on the threshold of a promising future, enjoying life to the full in the familial atmosphere of the Mann home and the tightly knit community of Ringsend. At his trial, when he described the way he spent Sunday, November the 21st, waking late, rushing out to Mass, coming back for his breakfast, meeting friends afterwards, coming home for the Sunday dinner at 2 o'clock, going to Croke Park for the fateful match between Dublin and Tipperary. This was a description of a typical, indeed perfect Sunday, suggestive of the comfortable life people enjoyed in spite of the troubles that were going on all around them. But Sunday, November the 21st was no ordinary day, as we now know. What happened that morning is now recognized as having changed the entire course of the War of Independence. Michael Collins' coordinated assault on the intelligence network that had been established by the military authorities in Dublin was the greatest challenge the British military intelligence apparatus had yet experienced. 19 agents in total were shot, 15 of whom died. In the days immediately following the assassinations, Dublin was seized with an atmosphere of terror. Dozens of military and intelligence personnel and their families crowded into Dublin Castle and the surrounding buildings in fear for their lives. Simultaneously, the security forces rounded up hundreds of suspects to be brought in for identification and interrogation. Tommy Whelan was one of the individuals who got caught up in this sweep. At 2 a.m. on the morning of Wednesday, November the 25th, he was arrested at his lodgings in Barrow Street and taken to Portobello Barracks. He was then moved to Arbor Hill Detention Camp for identification. During the following week, he was paraded twice. On the second of these parades, he was picked out of the lineup and identified as resembling one of the gunmen involved in the attack on 119 Lower Baggot Street. The following day, he was taken to the North Wall and put on board a naval gunship, the Sea Wolf, to be transferred by sea to Ballykinlar Camp in County Down. In December of 1920, Ballykinlar Camp, a former military barracks, was in the process of being developed into an internment camp for suspects arrested under the Restoration of Order in Ireland Act that had come into effect the previous August. This allowed for the suspension of the civil courts for those arrested on suspicion of IRA membership to be held without trial and for the use of the death penalty. In the wake of the Bloody Sunday killings, it was flooded with suspects, predictably. The vast majority of these were not active service volunteers, but some were, and this was a huge challenge for the High Command of the IRA. In the camp, a sophisticated system was quickly set up, with arrangements made to identify active service volunteers and have them switch identities with those who were regular civilians. The system was organised and run by a highly competent IRA officer called Patrick Colgan from County Kildare, who arranged to have new arrivals interviewed to see if they were innocent or if they needed what he called protection. On December the 3rd, Tommy Whelan arrived with 3 others, including a man called Aidan Corrie, who would figure largely in what's going to come. Colgan interviewed them and decided Whelan and Corrie were at risk, as he said, and this was either probably because they were members of the volunteers, and this could be verified. Colgan advised them to go undercover, meaning that arrangements would be made for men who resembled them to take their names and switch identities. After about a week, it became apparent that the name Thomas Whelan, the person, was a person of interest to the people who were running the camp. When his name was called for a second time, Colgan inquired why this had happened, and he was told, quote, Whelan was one of the lucky ones, that he was due for release, end quote. This only made Colgan all the more suspicious, and he tried unsuccessfully to persuade Tommy Whelan to stay undercover. But Whelan was so assured of his innocence and the fact that witnesses would provide an alibi for the fact that he was at Mass on the morning of Bloody Sunday, that he decided to present himself and voluntarily and to reveal his true identity. At his trial on February the 1st, he made a statement to the people overseeing the trial that when this happened in Ballykinlar, in other words, when he gave himself up, he was given an internment order, told to fill it out, that it would be sent to the Chief Justice in London and that he would be released. This never happened, of course. He was taken to Kilmainham, where another step in the attempt to secure a guilty verdict for him took place. The man who was alongside him, Aidan Corrie, did take Colgan's advice and stayed undercover. His identity was assumed by a young man from Drogheda called Owen Slowey, who was also taken to Kilmainham a few weeks after Tommy Whelan. Slowey was brutally tortured, but he never broke either to reveal his own identity or the alias of the man he was providing cover for back in Ballykinlar. When the camp was broken up and the inmates disbanded after the truce later in 1921, Corrie walked away a free man. Tommy Whelan, meanwhile, was taken back to Dublin and put in Kilmainham prison in an area, in a section called Murderers' Row, along with a group of prisoners that included Frank Teeling, Paddy Morden, Ernie O'Malley under the alias of Bernard Stewart, James Boyce, Michael J. Tobin, and James McNamara. Several of these men were awaiting trial for involvement in the Bloody Sunday shootings. Frank Teeling, who was the only one of those convicted for that event, who was actually found on site with a gun in his hand, he had already received the death sentence for the Mount Street attack. Two others, Joseph Rochford and Paddy Morgan, were awaiting trial for that same event. James Boyce, McNamara and Tobin were there for the Baggot Street attack, and they would be joined by Tommy Whelan. So there were 4 of them up for that house altogether. On behalf of Sinn Féin, Michael Collins had hired a solicitor, a well-known member of Dublin's Jewish community and nationalist sympathiser called Michael Noyak, to represent the prisoners. It is in his deposition to the Bureau of Military History, along with an account by Ernie O'Malley in his celebrated On Another Man's Wound, that we get again another more developed snapshot of Tommy Whelan after he left Ballykindler. The opinions of both men, that is of Ernie O'Malley and Michael Noyak, keeping in mind that their observations were related many years later, are remarkably similar in the way they describe both the personality of the young man and the sequence of events that led to his ensnarement. This suggests that his story was well known and remembered long after the events of 1921 were past history. Ernie O'Malley described in detail many of the men who were in that section of the prison, and when he came to Tommy Whelan, he said the following: Whelan's features were finer and more delicate, smooth-faced and brown-eyed with wavy hair. He smiled quietly and steadily. His voice was soft, and when he laughed with others, one knew that the fibre was not as hard and that there was a shade of wistfulness about him. O'Malley continued by claiming that Whelan had made a fatal mistake when he revealed to what he called a greasy-faced intelligence officer called May, who was actually the commandant of the prison, that he had indeed been a member of an IRA battalion. Michael Noyak's account was more observant in its detail and throws valuable light on what happened to Whelan previously in Ballykindler. Noyak described Whelan as, quote, a soft country boy with a beautiful character and a nice fresh complexion and very talkative. Like O'Malley, he noted the supercilious and ingratiating manner of the prison commandant. Sleuthering was the word that he used, who welcomed him, Noyak, that is, to the prison with the entreating, won't you do everything you can for poor Whelan, as he's so nice, end quote. Noyak immediately took a dislike to Commandant May, and he became suspicious of him. He asked Whelan if he had been talking to this man and what was the nature of the conversation that passed between them. Whelan admitted that Commandant May had said to him, I admire you, and as one soldier to another, I'd like to know what battalion you belonged to. And Whelan proudly stepped up to the plate and answered that he had been a member of C Company in Ringsend. Noyak's reaction was a mirror image of O'Malley's. With a sinking heart, he realised that the young Galway man had made a fatal mistake. As he had been duped to voluntarily hand himself over in Ballykindler, now he had really fallen into the trap that had been set for him in Kilmainham. In the opinion of Noyak, it was as good as having sealed his death sentence. The court-martial for Thomas Whelan and the 3 others implicated in the attack on 119 Lower Baggot Street was to begin on January 27th. The crime they were charged with was being accessory to the murder of Geoffrey T. Bagley, a disabled court-martial officer who had been resident at this address and shot on the morning of Bloody Sunday. There were 4 men identified as having taken part in the attack. The first witness who was called for the prosecution was a Lieutenant McClellan, who was in the room beside Bagley's. He described a group of gunmen coming up the stairs, 2 bursting into his room and ordering him to put his hands up as he was shaving, and others entering Bagley's room and fatally shooting him. He identified the man that stood in the door and covered him with a revolver as Tommy Whelan, and one of the others, James Boyce, is walking up and down the corridor outside when the shooting was taking place. As soon as it was over, it was about 5 minutes, all all the men in the group exited from the front of the building. The second witness to come forward was an army private who had been passing on a motorcycle, taking a dispatch from Dublin Castle to his superior in Blackrock, when he came upon the activity in Lower Baggot Street. He saw a group of men running out of the house, and then they went around a corner and ran into another group. These were groups, he said, of between 15 and 20. This other group was coming up Herbert Place, coming away from the attack on the house, Mount Street. He identified all four that were up for the Lower Baggot Street attack and claimed Whelan was the one who took his motorcycle away from him. He identified Boyce, McNamara and Tobin as being among the group he met on the street, but it was decided that his evidence was not strong enough, and they had very strong evidence that they had not been there on the scene. So Whelan was the only one of that four that was identified. And he was identified by both McClellan and Snelling. The witness who came forward to provide evidence that he could not possibly have been in Lower Baggot Street because he was at Mass in Ringsend Church on that morning at 9 o'clock. They were not believed. A maid who was in the house and who saw everything that was going on was not called as a witness. So on the basis of the testimony of those two witnesses, Tommy Whelan received the death sentence. And when the report was made after the court-martial was finished, the case for his conviction was as follows. They made 3 points. The fact that he was the only one identified by two witnesses, and this, that Whelan's name and address and occupation were on Michael Collins's roll, but they never produced evidence for this. And this, I think, is the key to the whole explanation of what happened to Tommy Whelan. It points to a feature or a syndrome of information related to what went on throughout the whole War of Independence, where the truth was kept hidden, it was buried, people were silent about it, and over the course of time, it simply evaporated. In the case of the attack of 119 Lower Baggot Street, for example, we know now that the man who led that was the 23-year-old Sean Lamass, the future Taoiseach or Prime Minister, widely acknowledged as a key figure in the making of modern Ireland. This information was kept under wraps until it was revealed by Tim Pat Coogan in 1961. And indeed, people were fairly quiet about it for long after that. Similarly, in the case of Paddy Morden, who was also identified by Snelling as part of the group that were coming away from the attack on the house on 38 Mount Street. And this was the primary evidence that secured Morden's death sentence. The supreme irony here is that Morden had the most cast iron alibi anyone could have. He had not been in Mount Street as he was charged. He was actually the leader of the unit in the Gresham where two men had been shot and killed. This information did not become public until his niece, May Morden of Knockvicar, County Roscommon, discovered it in her uncle's papers when she was working on his biography more than 70 years later. Clearly, knowledge about Lamass and Morden was known to a good number of people, but they remained tight-lipped about it and in many cases took it to their grave. In Tommy Whelan's case, the information that emerged more than 60 years later was as follows. There was a Whelan family in Ringsend who were active nationalists. One of their sons, a Patrick Whelan, had died in Boland's Mills in 1916. His brother, Thomas A. Whelan, had also fought in the Easter Rebellion. In the 1980s, a representative of this family visited the Clifden Whelans and revealed their belief that it was their uncle, Thomas Whelan of Ringsend, that the police were actually looking for when they arrested Thomas Whelan from Clifden. They were the same age. Thomas Whelan from Ringsend had also been born in 1898. And this man had almost the exact same profile as Paddy Morton. In other words, they were active service volunteers, IRA fighters, in other words. They both went out in 1916, and their names were certainly known to the authorities. If these two names were on a list of known suspects, and they were identified by witnesses considered credible as being part of the Bloody Sunday attacks, there was a very slim chance, if the authorities had them in custody, that they were going to be let go. The outcome of the trial, which ended on February 1st, was that Tommy Whelan from Clifden was convicted and condemned to death. The other three were acquitted. The news of Tommy Whelan's conviction and sentence was a huge shock to his family in the far west, who had nothing beyond letters and newspaper accounts to inform them of what had happened, of what was happening in Dublin. They had no relatives in the city or anywhere on the East Coast, and they were dependent on the Mann family and their sons' friends to keep them informed. Around the middle of January, it had already been decided that his mother, Bridget Whelan, would go to Dublin to be with her son and to help those who were organising a campaign for clemency. She set out from Clifden alone, dressed in the traditional paisley shawl and long black skirt as the country women wore in those times, travelling by train for the first time in her life. Her presence in Dublin gave a huge boost to the campaign to get clemency for the condemned men. Coming so soon after the execution of Kevin Barry, on November 1st, there was now another young man under death sentence, with a profile even more suited to martyrdom than the boyish and cavalier medical student whose death the previous November had such an enormous impact. As the case of Tommy Whelan began to become known, newspapers liked to refer to her as his, quote, poor old mother. In fact, she was neither poor nor particularly old. This photograph from 1917 with her daughter, Annie, aged 9, shows a trim and tidy middle-aged woman of 49. Progressive and forward-looking, she was known for her vivacious personality, sharp wit and generosity, and she was extremely popular with her neighbours and her friends in Clifden. During her time in Dublin, she lodged with the Mann family and got to know her son's community of friends, becoming a celebrity in her own right as her visits to the prison were reported, and she was feted at the Mansion House and came to know the leading figures of the time. She developed a great friendship with Arthur Griffith, who was in Mountjoy at this time, and she would have met him on her many visits. And she often later spoke of him with respect and reverence. She made such an impression on Michael Noyak that even over 40 years later, he would describe her as one of the most fascinating women he had ever known. Among her strongest supporters were Maud Gonne McBride, Charlotte Despard, and Alice Stopford Green, who had set up an organisation to support the wives and families of Republican prisoners. Maud Gonne would remain friends with Bridget Whelan for the duration of her life. She supported her appeal for a military pension on her behalf, and she visited her in Clifden on several occasions. Following the conviction of Thomas Whelan, the case of Paddy Morton was next on the list for court-martial for the Bloody Sunday events. A native of Crossna in County Roscommon, Morton was a stalwart and committed activist in both the Labour and nationalist movements, and he had fought in the 1916 rebellion. He was charged with involvement in the attack on 38 Mount Street, in which 2 intelligence officers were shot dead. Once again, acting for the defence, Michael Noyak was confident that Morton's case was watertight because of the credibility of his witnesses. The trial, scheduled to begin on February 15th, was preceded by one of the most remarkable episodes of the entire period of the Troubles. That is, the successful escape from Kilmainham of Ernie O'Malley, Frank Teeling, and Simon Donnelly. Paddy Morton was to be one of this group, but he stepped down at the last minute because he did not wish to throw a negative light on the witnesses who were scheduled to speak on his behalf the following day. Tommy Whelan's name was not on the list of those who were to escape, even though, like Frank Teeling, he had already been sentenced to death. There was speculation as to why this was the case, and it may have appeared that the IRA High Command wanted another martyr like Kevin Barry. Be that as it may, it was an arrangement no one was more in support of than Tommy Whelan himself. Over and again in letters, he said he was willing to give his life, that other more able and prepared than he was would go free to continue the fight outside. In this, he was not alone. After the execution of the 1916 leaders, the culture of martyrdom had been conjoined with the highest expression of patriotism. The deaths of Terence McSweeney and Thomas Ashe elevated the hunger strike as an even more potent weapon of martyrdom. But it was not the only one. Young men like Tommy Whelan and Owen Slowey, if they did not have the military experience to strike a blow for the cause, as Slowey put it, they could consciously and proudly take the fall if it meant their experienced comrades could go free to continue the struggle. This was a sentiment reflected in the mournful "Wrap the Green Flag Round Me, Boys," which became the anthem of the War of Independence. Unlike many militaristic marching songs of nationalist revolutions or rebellions, it was a dirge or lamentation in the face of death, the prayer of those who knew they were going to die, even though the cause they had fought for had not been achieved. Because of what had happened at Kilmainham with the escape, Morton and Whelan were moved to Mountjoy, considered a more secure prison. Between then and the day of the execution, these men formed a bond of friendship that became almost mythological. The stalwart and experienced Morton was 34, Whelan just 22. They shared food and stories and kept each other's spirits up. In a departure from what usually happened behind prison walls, they became friends with their warders, whom they mentioned frequently in their letters. One of the most remarkable legacies to have remained from this emotionally charged 3-week period was the extraordinary number of photographs that were taken inside the prison. It seems that the camera belonged to a young woman called Pauline Swan, Tommy Whelan's girlfriend. On 2 different occasions in his letters, he asks her if the camera was broken, suggesting that there was a risk in bringing it into the prison. But if there was, the issue was not with the auxiliary officers, who were happy to pose for pictures with the condemned men. The pictures were clearly staged as the shots of smiling uniformed officers who certainly did not give off the sense that they were worried that the pictures would put their lives in danger. They, of course, would all have been bred on the same cult of patriotic chivalry, the sanctity for dying for your country and so on, and they apparently had great respect for the condemned men. One of them in particular, an auxiliary officer called Lester Collins, said to be a native of Liverpool, formed a deep bond with Tommy Whelan. It was he who brought the box of chocolates that Whelan gave to the 9-year-old Alicia Mann, promising to eat them together if he was reprieved. She never opened the box, and it is now on display in Kilmainham Museum. Tommy Whelan left Collins his most precious personal possession, his prayer book, and Collins later visited the family in Clifden. And there was a rumor that he became a convert to Catholicism, but I haven't been able to verify that. In Clifden, there was a sense of unreality as the community began to realize what was happening to this young man who so recently had been at the Cannons, as he called it, and was part of a group of young people that included 2 shop assistants in Ward's grocery, Bernard Ludden and Pat O'Connor, that he was friendly with. In his letters home, he asked to be remembered to them and made repeated references to his neighbours and the good times they had enjoyed in the past. Whatever difference he had with Monsignor McAlpin quickly evaporated as the intrepid cleric lost no time in organising an appeal for clemency among the merchants and professionals of the town. They prepared a 6-page memorial testifying to Tommy Whelan's good character and the reasons why his trial was biased. McAlpin personally took it to Dublin, and he also interceded with Cardinal Logue to support the case for clemency. There was so much publicity about the trials of Morden and Whelan that they were biased and based on poor evidence, and there was so much support for them, especially from employers, clerical superiors, etc. It was felt that there was a good chance that they would be reprieved, but this did not happen. After February the 23rd, they were joined by 4 young men who had been captured with guns in their hand, captured on the scene, as it were, at what was called the Drumcondra ambush on January 21st. Like Kevin Barry, they were caught on the scene with guns in their hands, and the charge that was facing them was high treason. They were also sentenced to death after their court-martial on February 23rd, and they joined Whelan and Morden in Mountjoy to await the designation of the day they would be executed. They did not have long to wait. On Friday, the 10th of March, all 6 men learned that March 14th was to be the date of their execution. That was only 3 days hence. This was done so quickly because the hangman had to be brought in, and the speed with which it was done, it was hoped would preempt any kind of mass demonstrations. The crime they were, all 6 were charged with, was possession of firearms. None of the 6 that were executed were actually charged with having killed or injured anyone. They had 3 days to make their final preparations, and they spent it writing letters, having final visits with family members, and sustaining each other through mutual support. On the Saturday, they were allowed to meet together, and an account of how they spent this time was written on the inside of an envelope that Tommy Whelan sent to Pauline Swan. Apparently, they spent their time singing songs to keep their spirits up, with particular mention that Whelan and Brian were the 2 with the best voices. They took the lead. They pooled their money to put a bet on 2 horses running in the Lincolnshire Handicap the following Wednesday, when they would have departed this world. And they debated how they would spend their time in heaven once they crossed over. There were visits from the Sisters of Charity of Gardner Street and the prison chaplain, Canon Waters. At 5 p.m. on the Sunday, Tommy Whelan had the last visit from his mother. This was the occasion when he sang the Shawl of Galway Grey, which was always associated with his name, at least in our part of the world. When she came out of the prison to the waiting crowd outside, she reported that the condemned men were all happy and in good spirits and ready to meet their maker. Her son wrote her one last letter after she left and told her that she was the bravest woman he had ever known. At 4 a.m. on the morning of Monday the 14th, Canon Waters said Mass, with Whelan and Moran acting as servers. At 5:15, they left their compound and walked to the scaffold to meet their death at 6 a.m. A repeat of this took place with the remaining 4. They attended their last Mass and died together in pairs on the hour. At 8:30, the prison authorities posted a notice outside the gates of Mountjoy that the law had taken its course. Outside the prison gates, a crowd had been gathering since early morning. The relatives of the condemned men stood closest to the gates and joined in the praying of the rosary. The whole of Dublin had come to a standstill that day, as the Transport and General Workers Union had called for a general work stoppage. It was estimated that 40,000 people had gathered in the streets around the prison. Their voices joined in the murmur of the rosary in Irish. There were journalists in abundance to report the event, which made the front pages on newspapers all over the world. The famous photograph of Bridget Whelan with the mouth gone outside the gates of Mountjoy was perhaps the most visible and familiar expression of that awful morning. It was sent around the world with accounts of the events and added further weight to the growing international condemnation of British policy in Ireland and the increasing call for a peaceful resolution of the conflict. But peace was not yet at hand. The IRA's policy of swift reprisal had swung into play even before the day, March 14th, was over. An ambush in Drumcondra would end in several deaths and the arrest of Thomas Traynor, who would also end on the scaffold in Mountjoy. In Roscommon and Connemara, reprisal killings would begin a period of terror that would last for weeks. The IRA's flying column in Connemara was well organised and well armed, but they hadn't seen a lot of action up until that time. The execution of Tommy Whelan was the signal they were waiting for. On the night of March 16th, and this is the talk that you're going to be hearing from Kathleen Villiers-Tuttle after this, 2 policemen were shot in Clifden on the night of March 16th, the day before St. Patrick's Day. The incident unleashed a terror that up to that time had been unknown in that part of the country. The Black and Tans and auxiliaries were to come by train from Galway, and the town and surrounding areas were subjected to a terror that up to then they had managed to avoid. In 1996, on the 75th anniversary of my uncle's execution, my father was interviewed by Josephine de Courcy and Peggy Gibbons for Connemara Community Radio. As you'll hear in the interview, he was 14 years old at the time this took place. He never forgot the terror of having soldiers break open the door at 6 o'clock in the morning with open bayonets, or of what happened when he went into Clifden to post a letter to his mother to tell her not to return. I should just add, he was 89 when this interview took place, and he was still able to turn the tune, as they say.
So it must have been terrible when the news came back to Clifden of his execution.
Oh, it certainly was, but people had to bear with it. He was only one of many.
And I believe on the day after or 2 days after, that was the burning of Clifden.
Yeah, he was executed on the 14th, and the Tans arrived in Clifden on the 17th of March. If you like, you could, there was 2 policemen shot as reprisals for him on the night before St. Patrick's Day. And then the Tans arrived. They looted and burned before them, and
There was an awful lot of damage done that night.
oh, terrible, terrible. But luckily a lot of people escaped, or they would be dead as well. But they arrived here at my house then, at my father's house at 6 o'clock in the morning, looking for my 2 brothers. But there happened to be a wake in the village, and they were at the wake, and they got hold of it, and they took to the mountains, and they escaped. There'd be 3 dead instead of one, only for them.
But those were very hard years here.
Oh, very hard. But they burst into the house with the bayonets on top of the rifles, and put the bayonets under the beds to see was anybody hiding under the beds, and they went out and they first shots in the air, and they frightened us all. But luckily enough, they didn't shoot anybody.
There was a goose hatching somewhere. Did they shoot the goose on you?
They shot 2 geese.
And, I mean, was there any more reprisals then because of the execution, Joe?
No, there were no more prizes after that.
And your mother returned home to Faughira here?
Yeah. When they were shooting and burning, my mother went in to come home 2 days after Patrick's Day. So we didn't know what to do. So we decided on send our word not to come. So there was no phone or no, well, there could be a telegram at the time, but I was selected to go into town. My sister wrote a letter telling her not to come, addressed to the landlady where he was staying. And I was selected to go in and post a letter. So I met some of the boys coming home from Mass that didn't go to Mass, afraid to go to Mass. And they told me not to go in, as it was dangerous. So I've been used to be doing, I suppose, what I was told. I was going to fulfill my mission. So I went, I didn't go in the front way. I came into the back way of the post office. I knew the way because I was going to Clifden school at the time. And I knew the back way into the post office. But on my way out, I said, I go the front way. And there was two standing on the door with the rifles at the ready. So they asked me where did I come from. I told them I came in to post a letter. And they said, why didn't you come in the front way? I said, I was told by people up the road, I said that there was something wrong and not to go into the town. So they asked me a few more questions, but as I walked out the door, I saw the body of a man laying in the street, which turned out to be John Joe McDonald, after his own house where he was living. So they shouted at me then to run. But I had enough knowledge, which I had before, that was an excuse. If you ran, they made out you was trying to escape and they shot you. So I didn't run. I walked steadily back to footpath. I got around the corner, but I ran then. So I came home. My mother got a letter and she didn't come. Everything was quite in when she came. But when she did come home, we lived 2 miles outside the town, you see. I don't think there was much work here at that time. But she tried to get my father tried to get a sidecar to drive her home. But there was nobody different. They were too much afraid to drive her home. So finally, he got the end of a sidecar and he drove the car home there.
It was a sad time for them.
Oh, yes. My heart that no calling may own, there's a depth in my soul never sounded or known. There's a place in my memory, my life, that you fill. No one ever owned it, no one ever will. Sure, I love the dear silver that shines in your hair, and the brow that's all furrowed and wrinkled with care. I kiss the dear fingers so tired, worn for me. Oh, God bless you and keep you, Mother McCree. In these days just gone by, was made bright by the light of the smile in your eyes, like a candle that sets in a window at night. Your fond love has cheered me and guided me right. Sure, I love the dear silver that shines in your hair, and the brow that's all furrowed and wrinkled with care. I kiss the dear fingers so tired, worn for me. Oh, God bless you and keep you, Mother Macri.
Before Bridget Whelan left Dublin, she gave interviews to various newspapers and wrote an eloquent letter to the Lord Mayor and the people of Dublin, thanking them for their support. Her comments suggested that she never wanted to see Dublin again, but this was not true, actually. She thought the world of the Dublin people, and she did go back there after the truce and stayed for several months, some of it with Maud Gonne McBride. She attended the wedding of Corrigalia and Eileen Acton in September of 1921. And she also attended various functions for fundraising in Dublin and some of the East Coast towns like Dundalk. There was an invitation to go on a fundraising tour with Sinn Féin to the United States, but she could not avail of it for family reasons. She made lifelong friendships with the people who came to visit her in Clifden regularly over the following decades, and she always spoke of those days in 1921 with a mixture of pride and sorrow that had come to characterize the memory of those turbulent years in Ireland. More than most, her family was marked by the trauma. My mother, who cared for her in her later years, used to say that Granny always said the family never had any luck after Tommy's death. By 1930, the only one of them remaining at home, this was of the 13 children she had raised to adulthood, was my father, Joe Whelan. Another brother, Jim, came back from America in 1931, and a third brother, Festy, settled in Scotland, and he regularly came on visits. Most of her children, the sons particularly, died young. From what we know from investigated working while Irish, as they say, in very dangerous jobs was the explanation. But she did live, Granny lived until she was 94. She lived a long life, and her grandchildren were the great joy of her later years. You can see here in this picture when we were young. My sisters and I have vivid memories of the stories she told, of growing up in that part of Connemara when it was still Irish speaking. She and her husband were both native speakers, and of the dramatic events related to Uncle Tommy's death. Every spring she would have us gather armfuls of unopened daffodils from the grounds of the COASTGUARD station and Clifden Castle. They would be wrapped in newspaper and put in a shoebox and sent to Mountjoy to be placed on Uncle Tommy's grave. When his body and those of his comrades were given a state funeral and moved to Glasnevin in 2001, they were described as the, quote, forgotten 10, but they were never forgotten by those who loved them. Tommy Whelan's memory was kept as fresh as the daffodils that were sent for his grave every spring. Thank you very much.